Hello everybody, welcome to my third SQL Server Quickie. Today we are talking about allocation units inside SQL Server. As you might know, when you are creating a table inside the SQL Server database, SQL Server creates a whole hierarchy of objects for you. SQL Server always creates the table itself. Underneath the table you get at least one partition, which is very handy for partition switching if you need it. And underneath that specific partition, SQL Server creates up to 3 different allocation units for you. And today we are talking about those different allocation units. Before we go to SQL Server Management Studio, I want to demonstrate you on the flip chart which object SQL Server creates underneath when you are creating a new table through the create table statement. In the first step, SQL Server creates the table object itself. You can see that object in the table sys.tables inside SQL Server. Underneath the table, SQL Server creates for you at least one partition. It doesn't matter if you're using partitioning or not. It doesn't matter if you're using standard or enterprise edition. SQL Server always creates at least one partition for your table. That's very useful when you're using partitioning for other tables, and for example you want to switch in some data into that partition table, or if you want to switch some data out from your partition table. That partition can be seen in the table sys.partitions. And underneath that specific partition, SQL Server can create now up to 3 different allocation units. When you are creating a table with fixed length data types, for example integer, date, time, and so on, then SQL Server creates a so-called in-row allocation unit. In that allocation unit, SQL Server stores all your fixed length data types. When you are creating a table which also has columns with variable length data types, for example a varchar column, then SQL Server creates a so-called row overflow allocation unit for you. So in that row overflow allocation unit, SQL Server stores all variable length data types. And if your table has columns of LOB data types, for example varchar max, var-binary max, and so on, so all the big data types which can store up to 2 GB of data per each instance, then SQL Server creates a so-called LOB data allocation unit. So as you can see from that drawing, our table has at least one partition, and underneath that partition you can have 3 different allocation units. In-row allocation unit, row overflow allocation unit, and LOB data allocation unit. And those allocation units can be also found in one system view called sys allocation units. So let's now move over to SQL Server Management Studio and see how that works in reality. After you know from the flip chart what allocation units are inside the SQL Server database, I want to show you now with one simple example how you can explore and understand allocation units in SQL Server. So in the first step, I'm creating a new database called Allocation Units, and inside that database I'm creating a simple table. As you can see here, I'm just creating a table with fixed length data types, so we have some char columns, an integer column, and a date time column. When we go to sys tables, you can see we have one table inside our database. In sys columns you can see all the columns of our table. Sys indexes also shows one record for that table, a heap table, because we have created a table without a clustered index. And finally, when we go to sys partitions, you can see that SQL Server has created one partition for our table. So as I've already said on the flip chart, it doesn't matter if you're using partitioning or not. It doesn't matter if you're using Standard or Enterprise Edition. SQL Server always creates at least one partition for your table. And finally, when we take that partition ID and query sys allocation units, you can see that SQL Server has created for that partition an in-row data allocation unit. SQL Server has created that allocation unit for that specific partition because we have just a table with fixed length data types. When we add another column, a varchar column, which is a variable length data type, and we query sys allocation units again, you can see we have now two allocation units, the in-row allocation unit and also the row overflow allocation unit, which means SQL Server has created a new allocation unit for that table. And finally, when we add a LOB column like var_primary max to our table, SQL Server has created a third allocation unit, the so-called LOB data allocation unit. So all the LOB data is finally stored in that allocation unit for that specific partition. So let's insert a new record to that table. I'm just inserting here some data for the variable length column, some data for the LOB column, which means SQL Server can store all that data on one data page. As you can see in the in-row allocation unit, SQL Server has allocated two pages. The actual data page where our data is stored, and finally a so-called IM page, index allocation map page. We will look at IM pages in our next SQL Server Quickie in more detail. When we add another record where we are adding more variable length data, which SQL Server has to overflow in the row overflow allocation unit, you can see that SQL Server has allocated also two pages in the row overflow allocation unit. One data page for the overflown column, the variable length column, and again one page for the IM index allocation map page. And finally, when we are adding a third record into that table and we are inserting some LOB data, SQL Server allocates data in the LOB data allocation unit. So again, as you can see, SQL Server has allocated two pages, one page for the data itself and another page for the index allocation map page. In this SQL Server Quickie, we have talked about allocation units in SQL Server. As you have seen throughout that Quickie, SQL Server has a very intelligent structure to store our actual data inside allocation units. In our next SQL Server Quickie, we will talk about IM pages, index allocation map pages, and here you will finally see why SQL Server has to make that work with allocation units. So stay tuned and see you soon.